I'm Mike Lindsey, and we are going to talk about blisters. Why do I do this pointy thing at the camera? I don't know. That's not important. But what is important is blisters. All right. So when you look at treatment of a blister, you'll see that there are things that are seemingly on the opposite ends of the spectrum. You'll see drying powders as treatment for blisters. You'll also see lubricating ointments as treatment for blisters. Now that can seem kind of contradictory. Now, if you know why blisters form, then it'll make sense. So let's talk about why blisters form. Blister formation is caused by a shearing force among layers of tissue. So essentially you have multiple layers that are kind of moving in opposite directions, and that motion causes them to have tearing in between, which forms a little cavity. Now the body doesn't like cavity, so it fills it with a fluid. That fluid is what we call a blister. Now, what causes these to shear is essentially friction. There's multiple points of friction within your foot and the shoe. There's friction between the bone and the skin. There's friction between the skin and the sock. There's also friction between the sock and the inside of the shoe. And these points of friction cause shearing forces within our tissues. Now you're generally going to see a blister form on areas where the bone is shallow to the skin, because it gives more pressure and thinner layers that don't absorb that shear motion as well, and that causes to more tearing. Now the sort of enemy of your foot and the alias of blisters in a way is moisture. Moisture actually increases friction. So a moist foot has a higher friction compared to the sock, and the sock compared to the inside of the shoe, than either a dry example of that or a lubricated wet example of that. So by either drying your foot or by lubricating your foot, you decrease the friction that allows your foot to slide. That decreases that shearing forces on your tissue and makes it less likely that you're actually going to get formation of a blister. Now, I've mentioned powders and I've mentioned lubricant, but there are a number of things that can cause or that you can use to treat blisters, and we're going to list them here-ish. So as I'm going to keep this up, I'm going to continue talking about them. Now, some common things that we do is we tape our feet. And why do we tape our feet? Well, we're also trying to change that friction. Specifically, the most important thing that you can do when it comes to decreasing the likelihood of a blister forming is to act before it forms. So you're going to get a red area before you actually get formation of a blister. We tend to call this a hot spot, that red area. If you interact when you're just at the hot spot, you can stop the formation of a blister and really make a difference in outcome. And obviously blisters can ruin a trip. And so taking blister care seriously will make your trip a whole lot better, because no one wants to walk miles with a tender area. When it comes to blister prevention, there are a few things to keep in mind. First is the fit of the shoe. If you have a brand new shoe and you try to go on a long hike or a long run with it, your foot and the shoe have not grown accustomed to each other, in other words. And so you'll tend to have points that rub. You shouldn't buy a brand new shoe to take it on a big hike. Instead, you should buy the shoe weeks in advance and then slowly break in the shoe so as to avoid development of the blisters when you're actually on your hike. The second is skin resilience. If you try to run a marathon, yet you've not been running to prepare for the marathon, even if it's an old shoe, you're probably going to develop some blisters because you have not grown the skin resilience in order to avoid getting blisters on the run. Now, when it comes to actually preventing the blisters once you develop hot spots, there are a few techniques you can use. I'm going to show you some taping techniques for a couple hot spots on this particular foot. So we're going to use two different items. This happens to be moleskin, and this is kinesio tape. Now, they both have their uses in given situations. I find that the moleskin tends to be a little smoother, tends to slide a little easier and have less friction, but this kinesio tape does tend to stay on better, particularly in moist conditions, though I don't endorse necessarily one over the other. I think they both have their uses. So on this foot, we do have a hot spot that's developing back here. You can see how it's red. So we're going to use a very simple technique using this moleskin. Now I've cut out basically a square, and then I'm going to put it on there. It's as simple as that. A couple things to keep in mind: try to round edges. The edges are a point where they tend to catch. So by rounding these edges, it makes it less likely that those corners are going to catch and remove it. When you're laying it on, be sure that if there's any skin wrinkling, to try to avoid that. Put it right on the middle. Make sure the edges are nice and flat, that there are no creases. Now we're going to do a little more complex technique by doing the toe. Now there's a hot spot starting to develop right here, so we're going to tape this toe. Now there are a number of ways to tape the toe. I'm just going to show you the way that I generally use. First, we're once again going to start out by rounding the corners. Once again, those corners tend to be the area that it catches. Kinesio tape tends to be a little have some elasticity. We're going to flatten it as we put it down. We don't want creases. Now, another advantage of Kinesio tape is the ability to make these dog ears, because it is elastic. Now, with these dog ears, these little corners sticking out, that would be bad. That would be an area to rub on this other toe and be causing a blister here. But because of the elasticity, it allows us to simply cut off the dog ears. Now this area is flat and smooth. There's no raised point. Once again, I'm going to round the corner. Now, I'm going to try to cover the other exposed part of the toe. Now, what I'm keeping in mind as I'm placing this is that I know the area in question that's getting rubbed on is right here. I don't want any additional bunching right there if I can help it at all. What I'm going to do is place the seam of this on top of the toe, so as to avoid the exposed area. And I'm going to make them even. Once again, don't allow creases, pulling it a little bit at times to get it to lay nice and flat. Notice that they don't bunch up. There. We have a nice, smooth surface all around the toe. Now, these are not the only techniques to prevent blisters. These are just a couple of examples. Some other examples, just to mention a few: wearing a different type of socks, wearing toe socks, wearing multiple socks, wearing moisture wicking socks. And I mentioned earlier, drying compounds, lubricating point compounds. There are a number of other techniques that you can use. Every foot is different. You should find what individually works for you the best. And that is some tips and tricks for blisters.